In the quiet line of the supermarket, a young mother in a green sweater clutched her baby tightly. Beside her, a little girl barely 4 years old looked up with wide, tearful eyes, while on the counter sat the can of formula they could not afford. Just a few steps behind, a wealthy man in a dark suit watched in silence, unaware that this very moment would change his life forever. And before we continue, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? In the high-rise apartment overlooking the dazzling lights of Chicago, a millionaire sat down to dinner alone, the luxurious meal as cold as his own soul. Richard Hale's life was built on schedules that never faltered. At 55, he was CEO of Hale Mart, a supermarket empire with hundreds of locations across the Midwest. His signature could send a wave through the stock market. His board of directors called him disciplined, investors called him reliable, and the business press called him brilliant. None of them called him lonely. The penthouse where he lived rose above Michigan Avenue. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the magnificent mile as December snow blurred neon lights and traffic. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished marble floors reflected the glow of recessed lighting. Artworks hung on the walls, chosen not because they meant anything to him, but because they were expensive. The silence in the space was so complete it hummed. At the center of it all sat Richard at his dining table. White linen stretched across its length, a silver knife and fork positioned with geometric precision. His dinner, an expertly grilled steak, roasted vegetables, a glass of Merlot could have been photographed for a magazine. Yet beside the porcelain plate lay a folder of reports. His fork speared the meat while his eyes devoured profit charts. He chewed mechanically, tasting almost nothing. Numbers always tasted the same. He thought about projections for the holiday season, margins on imported goods, strategies for capturing market share. The food nourished his body, but the numbers were what he lived on. A soft knock at the door had come earlier. One of the building's staff had poked her head in with a tentative smile. "Would you like us to bring in a Christmas tree, Mr. Hale? It's the season." He didn't look up from his papers. Number, not this year. She had withdrawn quietly, her shoes clicking softly on the tile. The door closed, and the apartment returned to its perfect silence. From somewhere below, faint through the glass, drifted the bells of St. James Cathedral. They marked the coming of Christmas, but Richard didn't notice or pretended not to. Holidays had no meaning for him. They only interrupted sales cycles and complicated staffing. He told himself he preferred efficiency, but sometimes, against his will, memory pushed through. He thought of his ex-wife. 2 decades had passed since she walked away, carrying with her every scrap of warmth their home had ever known. She had pleaded with him once, "Richard, our son needs you. He needs more than a paycheck. He needs a father." Richard had answered with late nights at the office and empty promises. Eventually, she stopped asking. Now he was here, his empire larger than he had once dreamed, and yet his dinners looked like this silverware shining, food untouched, silence pressing in from every side. He rose from the table and crossed to the window. Snow swirled in fat flakes against the glass. Below, headlights slid along the street. He watched a family cross at the corner, a father carrying bags, a mother clutching a toddler, a little girl skipping in boots much too big. Their laughter floated faintly upward, threading through the glass barrier that separated their world from his. Something in his chest shifted, just slightly. For a fleeting moment, the sight of that family below carried him back to another life. He remembered his summer afternoon years ago, when he had walked through a park with a young woman whose laughter was brighter than the sunlight. Laura, that was her name. She had believed in him before the business world did, and he had let her slip away. He told himself then that work mattered more. The ache of that memory had dulled over the years, buried beneath reports and deadlines. But tonight, with snow swirling over Chicago, it rose sharp and undeniable. Richard turned away from the glass, annoyed at himself. Sentimentality was a weakness. Regret was wasted energy. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, crossed back to the table, and reached for his phone. The glow from the screen lit his face as he scrolled through tomorrow's schedule. Calls with investors, strategy sessions, lunch with the CFO. And then his gaze caught on a line that usually meant nothing to him: store inspection, South Side. Normally he ignored such visits, delegating them to regional managers. The reports told him everything he wanted to know. Why step into a store when spreadsheets laid it out in clean, exact columns? But tonight, the idea of seeing one of his supermarkets in person lingered. He pictured narrow aisles, the hum of fluorescent lights, shoppers bundled in coats, counting dollars and cents as they placed groceries on the conveyor belt. The thought unsettled him. For decades, customers had been abstract units of data, average basket size, revenue per square foot. Yet the laughter of the little girl on the street below still echoed in his head, as if daring him to look closer. He walked through the apartment, its vast rooms echoing with his footsteps. The art on the walls meant nothing. The wines lined up in the rack were bottles he rarely opened. He paused in the doorway to the study, where rows of leather-bound business books stood in perfect order. This was the life he had built, the fortress of efficiency he had chosen over everything else. And tonight, it felt smaller than ever. Back at the window, he pressed a hand against the cool glass. Far below, more families hurried home through the snow, their arms full of groceries, their children's voices rising above the city noise. He imagined stepping out among them, not as Richard Hale, the CEO, but as a man carrying a bag of bread and milk for a kitchen where children waited. He wondered what it would feel like to be part of that world instead of watching it from above. The idea lodged itself deep in him. He couldn't shake it, no matter how he tried. Maybe it was the season. Maybe it was the emptiness of his own apartment. Or maybe it was simply time. He returned to the table, shut the folder of financials, and left the steak unfinished. The silence of the penthouse pressed heavier than ever, as if daring him to step out of it. That night, Richard decided he would personally visit one of the supermarkets in the South Side, a trip that would change his life forever. In the dim fluorescent light of the South Side Hale Mart, Richard stepped through the sliding doors the next afternoon. The air smelled faintly of detergent and coffee from the small kiosk at the entrance. He wore a dark wool coat and a gray scarf, blending in more than he expected. Most of the shoppers were too busy hurrying through the aisles to notice him. It had been years since he last walked one of his own stores as anything other than a name on a quarterly report. The space felt smaller than he imagined. Shelves leaned slightly with the weight of canned goods, and the floor tiles showed the scuffs of thousands of shoes. The produce section near the front displayed bruised apples and bananas on discount. Richard paused by the dairy section, watching an older woman carefully compare 2 cartons of milk. She set one back and chose the cheaper brand, muttering about pennies. He felt something stir in him, uneasy recognition of the kind of calculation he had never made in his life. He continued down the aisle until his attention caught on a young woman entering the checkout line. She couldn't have been more than 28. Her winter coat looked worn at the edges, and a knitted scarf hung loosely around her neck. In one arm, she carried a baby bundled in blankets, no more than 3 months old. With her free hand, she guided a little boy, perhaps 6, whose blonde hair stuck out from under a too big beanie. Richard slowed his steps. He didn't know why, but something about the way she moved, tired yet determined, pulled at him. He positioned himself near a magazine rack by the registers, pretending to browse, though his eyes were fixed on her. On the conveyor belt, she placed only 3 items: a canister of infant formula, a pack of diapers, and a loaf of whole wheat bread. The cashier, a woman in her 50s with graying hair tucked into a bun, scanned each item with practiced efficiency. "That'll be 27 even," she said flatly. The young mother pulled a small, synthetic wallet from her pocket. The seams were frayed, the corners worn thin. She tipped it over and began counting coins into her hand. 50 cents, $1, 2, 3. Her fingers trembled slightly as she laid the coins out carefully on the counter. Richard found himself leaning forward, heart thudding in a way that made no sense to him. The baby stirred, let out a soft cry, then a sharper wail. The little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, when are we going to eat?" His voice was high and thin, the kind of question only a child could ask with such innocence. The woman's lips pressed together. She whispered, almost to herself, "I'm sorry, I'll have to put the milk back." Her words cracked with exhaustion. Richard froze. He watched as she slid the canister of formula across the counter, back toward the cashier. The baby's cries grew louder, filling the small space. The little boy's eyes widened, confused. From behind his magazine rack, Richard felt the air shift. For years, he had thought of customers as data points, buying patterns to be analyzed. Yet here was a moment stripped of numbers, a mother forced to choose between feeding her infant or keeping her dignity. It shook him in a way boardroom arguments never had. He clenched the edge of the rack, his knuckles whitening. This wasn't a story in a report. It was happening in his store, under his prices, under his name. The cashier slid the canister of formula aside without comment. She adjusted the total on the register. 13 even, she said, her voice calm but detached, as if she had seen this scene too many times to react anymore. The young mother nodded quickly, her cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. She gathered the remaining coins and added a crumpled $3 bill from her jeans pocket. The cashier counted the money and bagged the diapers and bread in a thin plastic sack. "Here you go, ma'am," she said, handing the bag over. The little boy stared at the formula container still sitting on the counter. "Mom, what about the milk for the baby?" he asked, his voice breaking with confusion. His mother knelt down, brushed his hair back gently, and whispered something Richard couldn't hear. Whatever she said brought a faint, fragile smile to the boy's face. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on the canister. The baby's cries grew sharper, echoing off the shelves. Customers in line behind them shifted uncomfortably, glancing at their watches. The young woman tucked her baby closer, murmuring soothing words while trying to juggle the bag of groceries and her son's small hand. Richard stood motionless, his heart hammering. Shame welled up inside him, not the social kind that feared embarrassment, but something deeper. This was his store, his prices, his empire. And here, under the fluorescent lights, a mother had just lived through one of the most humiliating moments imaginable, because she couldn't afford $10 more. He remained frozen as she hurried toward the exit. The boy skipped a little to keep up, pretending everything was fine, while the infant's cries filled the space. Richard watched them disappear into the night, the snow blowing in through the sliding doors before they closed again. He didn't move until the cashier picked up the abandoned canister of formula and set it back on a shelf. Then, with a strange heaviness in his chest, he turned and left the store. That night, back in his penthouse, Richard sat at his dining table, untouched food in front of him. The city lights shimmered outside as always, but they no longer looked like success. They looked like distance. His mind replayed the scene over and over. The trembling hands counting coins, the boy's innocent question, the sound of a baby crying for milk. He closed the financial reports spread before him. For the first time in years, the numbers blurred. He could not see profits, only faces. Sleep did not come easily. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the young woman's flushed cheeks, the boy's wide eyes, the cashier's practiced indifference. He tried to bury it under rationalizations, market forces, personal responsibility, consumer choice, but none of it silenced the shame. Richard had always told himself he was a man of facts, not feelings. Yet tonight, feelings refused to be ignored. The emptiness of his apartment pressed in on him harder than ever. The silence was deafening compared to the sound of that baby's cries. And as the snow fell heavier over Chicago, Richard Hale walked out of the supermarket with a heavy heart, feeling for the first time in many years ashamed of the very success that had built his empire. In his glass-walled office high above downtown Chicago, Richard Hale sat at his desk with the city skyline stretching gray and frozen beyond him. Normally, mornings meant energy, coffee, steaming, spreadsheets aligned, the rhythm of efficiency carrying him through each hour. But today, nothing fell into place. The reports lay open before him. Profit margins for December, projections for the new year, charts showing Halemart's steady climb. Yet instead of numbers, he saw faces. He saw a young woman with trembling hands, a little boy tugging at her sleeve, a baby wailing for milk. The memory was so vivid that it drowned out the words of his chief financial officer, who spoke across the conference table in calm tones about supply chains and seasonal promotions. "Richard, with the current pricing structure, we're forecasting a 6% lift," the CFO was saying. Richard blinked, forcing himself back. "Fine," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind, staring out the window at the river winding sluggishly between towers. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered. Lines cut deeper around his eyes, not just from age, but from strain he had ignored for years. Sleep had been nearly impossible since that night in Southside. He lay awake, hearing the sound of coins clinking against a counter, the crack in a mother's voice, the innocent question of a child. He had thought such details belonged to someone else's life, far removed from the executive suites he occupied. But now, they followed him like ghosts. At lunch, instead of joining colleagues at the club, He found himself walking again toward the South Side store. He pulled a cap low on his forehead, tucked his scarf up, and tried to blend with the shoppers. No one paid him any attention. He wandered the aisles slowly, not with the cold eye of a businessman, but with the uneasy curiosity of a stranger. He saw mothers with calculators in hand, comparing brands for a few cents difference. He saw an older man in a worn coat holding a can of soup and staring at it for a long time before setting it back. Two teenagers argued softly about whether they could afford the larger box of cereal. Each scene felt heavier than the last. Near the end of an aisle, Richard spotted the same young woman again. She was without her children this time, but her movements carried the same urgency. She clutched a handwritten list, folded and refolded from use. She walked with quick, precise steps, heading only for shelves marked with sale tags. She checked each price twice before placing anything in her basket. Richard followed at a respectful distance, something pulling him along, though he could not explain it. The store felt different through her eyes. He noticed the fatigue in her shoulders as she lifted heavy items, the way she skipped entire aisles that held luxuries she clearly couldn't consider. When she reached checkout, she unloaded her basket with careful order. Pasta, rice, bread, bananas, marked down because of brown spots, detergent, diapers, children's medicine. The total came to $23.40. She counted the money twice, sliding the exact amount across with a faint smile of triumph, as though this tiny victory held the weight of a marathon. Richard's throat tightened. Watching her, he felt an ache he couldn't dismiss. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't data. This was survival. Richard stepped outside the store just as the young woman disappeared into the cold. Snow had begun again, drifting down in fine flakes that coated her coat and hair as she carried her bags up the block. She walked briskly, shoulders hunched, but there was no hesitation in her stride. He kept a careful distance, drawn by something he didn't fully understand. For 15 minutes he followed, weaving through the side streets of Southside Chicago. The neighborhood looked weary. Apartment buildings from the 1972nd lined the street, their bricks chipped, paint peeling from window frames. Old posters curled on telephone poles, and stairwells smelled faintly of damp concrete. She approached a block of housing projects, the kind city officials always promised to repair but never did. Richard watched as she shifted the bags to one arm and climbed 5 flights of stairs without pause. The elevator door was taped shut with a handwritten note. Out of order. By the time she disappeared through a heavy metal door at the top, her breath came in visible puffs, but she never faltered. Richard stood at the bottom, hands deep in his coat pockets, his heart unsettled. He had come only to observe, but what he saw pressed on him harder than any boardroom debate ever had. This was not theory. This was not a chart in a quarterly report. This was a young mother balancing hunger and dignity, dragging survival up 5 flights of stairs. That night, back in his penthouse, he couldn't escape the images. He sat in front of the untouched dinner once again, but instead of the quiet comfort of solitude, shame gnawed at him. For the first time in years, the apartment felt unbearably hollow. He picked up the phone and called his head of human resources. "Send me the personnel files for the South Side store," he ordered. His assistant, surprised, agreed to deliver them by morning. Richard spent the night reading about the employees, about the neighborhood demographics, about the fact that 40% of families in that district lived below the poverty line. The statistics he once skimmed now stabbed at him. Youth unemployment at 35%, 1 in 3 families admitting they skipped meals so children could eat. These weren't abstract numbers anymore. They were faces. The boy's question, "What about the milk for the baby?" rang through his head again and again. In the quiet hours before dawn, Richard stood at the window, watching the city slowly stir to life. Delivery trucks rumbled below. A man shoveled the sidewalk in front of a diner, and the smell of bacon and coffee drifted faintly upward. For the first time in his life, Richard realized he had built wealth on the backs of people who lived every day at the edge of hunger. He pressed a hand against the glass, whispering words even he hadn't expected. "I can't keep looking away." The afternoon light filtered weakly through the windows of Hyde Park Cafe, one of those neighborhood spots that had survived decades without ever trying to be fashionable. The tables were mismatched, the mugs chipped, and the old jukebox in the corner still played Sinatra on weekends. Students from the nearby university tapped on laptops. Construction workers warmed their hands around paper cups, and a pair of retirees debated the Cubs' chances in the coming season. Richard Hale chose this place deliberately. It was far from the gleaming restaurants he usually visited with colleagues, and here, no one would recognize him as the man who owned half the supermarkets in Chicago. He wore a wool coat and a plain scarf, the kind of clothes that blended into the crowd. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was out of place, like a man trespassing in a life he'd never dared to live. A waitress came by, pouring coffee into a thick ceramic mug. "Need cream, hon?" she asked. "No, thank you," Richard replied softly, folding his hands around the mug for warmth. The coffee was bitter, but it steadied him. He wasn't here for the drink. He was waiting, though he couldn't admit it out loud. The bell over the door jingled, and there she was. Emily Carter stepped in, brushing flakes of snow from her hair. She looked the same as she had in the supermarket, weary but composed, carrying herself with the quiet strength of someone who had no choice but to keep moving forward. Today, she wasn't burdened with children or grocery bags. She walked to the counter, ordered a small coffee, and counted her change carefully before sliding it across to the cashier. Richard's heart hammered in his chest. He felt ridiculous, like a schoolboy staring at his first crush. But when she turned with her cup in hand, he gathered courage. "There's plenty of room here," he said, gesturing to the empty chair at his table. Emily hesitated. Her eyes flicked over him with a mixture of caution and politeness. Finally, she gave a small nod and sat down. "Thanks," she murmured, setting her coffee between them. The silence stretched for a moment, filled only by the hiss of the espresso machine and the clink of spoons against mugs. Richard forced himself to speak. "Cold day out there." Emily gave a faint smile. "They all are lately." She wrapped her hands around her cup, as if drawing every ounce of warmth she could. Richard studied her features more closely. She had Laura's eyes, the same hazel flecked with green, the same way they seemed to hold more questions than answers. He swallowed hard. "If you don't mind me asking, are you from around here?" "Born and raised," Emily said. "South Side mostly. Never really had the chance to leave." She paused, then added with a touch of pride, "It's home." Richard nodded, though inside regret twisted like a knife. He had once promised Laura that they would see the world together. Now her daughter had barely seen beyond Chicago. Emily reached into her wallet for a napkin and pulled out a faded photograph without realizing it. Richard's eyes caught on it immediately. A young woman with curly hair smiled brightly from the worn picture, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. Richard's breath caught. "She's beautiful," he whispered before he could stop himself. Emily glanced at the photo, then back at him. "That's my mom, Laura Thompson. She passed when I was little." She slid the photo closer for him to see, not noticing how his hand trembled as he touched the edge. The world seemed to tilt. His Laura staring back at him from the photo, frozen in time. The same radiant smile, the same warmth. Richard's throat tightened. "She looks happy," he managed. "She was," Emily said softly. "At least, that's what people tell me. I don't remember much. Just stories from neighbors, from people who knew her." Richard wanted to tell her everything, that he had known her mother, that he had once loved her more than he loved himself, that walking away was the greatest mistake of his life. But the words wouldn't come. Fear held him still. Fear of shattering Emily's world. Fear of being despised for the choices he had made. Instead, he asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder what her life was like before?" Emily stirred her coffee, eyes downcast. "All the time. I've always wished I knew more. People say she was strong, but I can tell she carried a lot on her own. Sometimes I think, maybe that's why I can't let myself fall apart. I owe her that." Richard looked away, blinking against the sting in his eyes. He remembered Laura exactly that. Way strong, resilient, carrying burdens he should have shared but didn't. The shame was almost unbearable. A waitress stopped by with the check for Richard's coffee. He left a $10 bill on the table, waving away the change. Emily glanced at him, surprised. "Most people don't tip like that around here." "Most people should," Richard said, his voice firm. They lingered a little longer, speaking about ordinary things, the rising cost of groceries, the challenges of Chicago winters, the neighborhood kids who played stickball in the alley, even in the snow. For a moment, Richard allowed himself to pretend this was normal, that he was simply an older man sharing coffee with a younger woman who happened to be a friend, not the daughter he had never known. But when Emily finally rose to leave, The pretense collapsed. He wanted to call out, to tell her the truth, to reach across decades of silence. Instead, he only said, "Take care of yourself, miss." She smiled politely, adjusting her scarf. "You too." Then she was gone, stepping into the swirl of snow outside, disappearing into the city. Richard sat back, staring at the empty chair across from him. His hand rested on the photograph she had left on the table for a moment by accident. He traced Laura's smile with a trembling finger before sliding it carefully back toward her abandoned napkin. When he finally whispered into the silence, the words were for himself alone. "She's my daughter." The week after his meeting with Emily, Richard Hale could not escape the unrest inside him. His office, once a fortress of certainty, now felt like a cage of glass and steel. The Chicago skyline stretched beyond his windows, but it no longer dazzled him. Every shining tower reminded him of what he had built, and every shadow on the streets below reminded him of the lives his empire had neglected. For decades, he had thought of Hale Mart as his crowning legacy. Now he could only see it as a mirror reflecting choices he wished he had never made. The sound of coins clinking on a supermarket counter echoed in his ears when he tried to sleep. The photo of Laura in Emily's wallet hovered in his mind like a ghost refusing to rest. He had lived by numbers, but numbers had betrayed him. On a bleak Tuesday morning, he summoned his senior executives. They filed into the Hale Mart boardroom, an expansive chamber of polished mahogany and glass, where portraits of past leaders gazed down in silent judgment. Richard usually felt at ease here, but today his heart pounded. He had resolved to speak words that would change everything. When the chatter settled, he rose slowly. "We need to discuss our pricing structure," he said. His voice carried more gravity than usual. "Especially essentials. Formula, diapers, bread, milk. We've been charging families more than any decent conscience should allow." A murmur rippled around the table. Mark Benson, the CFO, leaned back in his chair. "Richard, with all respect, those categories are stable. Parents will always buy them. Our margins are industry standard. In fact, they're the foundation of quarterly growth." Richard's jaw tightened. He remembered Emily's trembling hands at the register, the baby's cries. "Industry standard or not, it is wrong. I watched a mother put back infant formula because she could not afford it, in our store, under our name." Silence thickened. Sarah Miller, head of operations, folded her hands. "What are you proposing?" Richard took a deep breath. "From this moment forward, all essential family goods will be sold at cost, zero profit margin. Additionally, we will create a confidential fund for any parent still unable to pay." The room erupted. One executive barked, "That's corporate suicide." Another slammed a pen onto the table. "Investors will flee." Voices overlapped until Richard lifted his hand. The noise subsided. "I know what you're thinking," he said firmly. "That this will ruin our balance sheets, that shareholders will revolt. Maybe they will. But what I saw at that register was not a financial problem. It was a moral failure. I will not allow Hale Mart to profit while children go hungry." Mark Benson's voice grew sharp, the kind of edge honed by years of boardroom combat. "Richard, you're talking about dismantling decades of strategy. This isn't about feelings, it's about survival. You'll tank the stock, and every news outlet will crucify you. Our investors don't pay us to run a charity." Richard leaned forward, his fingers pressing hard into the polished wood of the table. Then maybe it's time they did. Maybe it's time this company stood for more than squeezing profit out of desperate families. His voice, normally measured and cold, rang with an emotion most of them had never heard from him before. The room froze. Some executives stared at their notepads, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the moral ground suddenly spread beneath their feet. For decades, Hale Mart had been run on ruthless efficiency. Compassion had never been on the agenda. Finally, Sarah Miller broke the silence. Her voice was softer than usual, but steady. "If this is the road you choose, Richard, I'll stand with you. It won't be easy. We'll lose people. But maybe," she glanced around at her colleagues, "maybe this company has forgotten what community means." The words hung in the air like a fragile bridge. Richard nodded, grateful, then looked around the room. "I won't pretend this is simple. It isn't. But I am done profiting off hungry children. If that means fighting investors, so be it. If it means losing my title, so be it. But this company will not be remembered as the empire that let babies cry for milk." The meeting ended with unrest thick in the air. Half the board walked out muttering about betrayal and recklessness. Mark Benson shoved his papers into his briefcase and stormed out without a word. But Richard had spoken with the authority of majority shareholder. The decision stood. That evening, unable to bear the silence of his penthouse, Richard drove back to the Southside Hailmart himself. The storm had worsened. Snowflakes whirled in dizzy spirals under the streetlights, clinging to his windshield and painting the sidewalks in white. He parked, pulled up his collar, and entered the store. Inside, the hum was the same as always. The buzz of fluorescent lights, the squeak of carts, the shuffle of weary feet. Yet something was different. Above the infant aisle hung a brand new sign, hastily printed but bold, "No child-hungry essentials at cost." Richard's chest tightened. He moved slowly toward the registers, blending with the crowd. A young mother, her cheeks raw from the cold, stepped into line with a basket holding formula and diapers. Her hands trembled as if expecting disappointment. The cashier scanned the items. "That'll be $12.50. The woman froze. I think you made a mistake." The cashier smiled, sliding the receipt forward. "No mistake, ma'am. It's the new program. All essentials are sold at cost now." The woman's lip quivered. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank God," she whispered. She clutched the bag as though it were treasure. Her little boy tugged at her coat, grinning. "Mama, we got the milk this time. We got it!" His shout filled the air, piercing Richard's heart with both joy and shame. Richard turned away, blinking hard. He had closed multi-million-dollar deals without emotion. But tonight he was undone by the sight of a child rejoicing over milk. He stayed until closing, watching family after family discover the same relief. One father laughed in disbelief, holding diapers aloft like a prize. An elderly grandmother whispered blessings over the cashier, who only smiled back. Gratitude spread like warmth, softening the harsh edges of poverty. When Richard finally left, snow crunched beneath his shoes. He looked back at the glowing sign above the entrance, its light spilling onto the street like a beacon. For the first time in decades, he felt hope stirring inside him, hope that perhaps redemption was possible. Driving north along Lakeshore Drive, the city lights stretched before him, blurred by falling snow. They no longer mocked him with reminders of hollow wealth. They shimmered like small beacons of possibility, calling him toward something greater. "This is only the beginning," he whispered into the night, and for once he believed it. The storm had cleared by the weekend, leaving Chicago blanketed in white. Icicles hung from the eaves of houses, and the sidewalks glistened with salt. Richard Hale woke early in his penthouse, the silence almost unbearable. For years, his routine had been mechanical: a workout, a protein shake, a chauffeur waiting at the curb. But this morning he moved slower, lingering by the window as dawn painted the skyline in pale gold. He poured his own coffee, something he had not done in years, and found himself thinking again of the Southside families. He saw the tears of relief in the eyes of the young mother, the triumphant shout of her child. The memory had planted itself deep inside him, and it refused to loosen. By mid-morning, he made a decision. Pulling on a wool coat and a plain knit cap, he left his penthouse without his driver. Instead, he hailed a cab on Michigan Avenue, startling the driver, who glanced back and realized this was the famous CEO. Richard only smiled faintly. "Southside, please," he said. The cab rolled through neighborhoods where snow had not been cleared as neatly as in the wealthy districts. Children in secondhand boots kicked at frozen piles, laughing despite the cold. Corner diners served steaming plates of eggs and toast to customers who tipped in coins instead of bills. Life here was rougher, but also somehow more real. Richard arrived at the Hailmart store just before noon. He pushed open the sliding doors and stepped into the familiar hum. Yet what greeted him was unlike anything he had ever seen in one of his own stores. The aisles were busier than usual, alive with parents comparing lists, elderly shoppers greeting cashiers by name, children skipping alongside carts. Word had spread quickly. Families were coming not only for food, but for dignity. He moved carefully among them, hood drawn low, pretending to browse. He saw a father holding his toddler on one hip while reaching for a carton of milk. He saw a grandmother clutching a pack of diapers with tears in her eyes. Each scene touched him more deeply than the last. At the checkout lines, Richard lingered by the magazines again. A young couple counted coins nervously, only to realize the total was far less than expected. The relief on their faces lit up the entire lane. Behind them, another mother laughed out loud when she realized she could buy both formula and bread. The cashier, a middle-aged woman named Denise, worked tirelessly, explaining the program to each customer. Richard knew her file 20 years with the company, steady and loyal, but he had never spoken to her. Today he wanted to thank her, but he stayed silent, afraid of breaking his cover. Instead, he watched. He listened. And with every passing minute, the conviction inside him grew. This was no temporary gesture. This had to become the soul of Heartwarming. Richard remained in the store for nearly 2 hours, drifting from aisle to aisle like a man rediscovering a language he had forgotten. Every face, every exchange seemed to hold a message. A young boy insisted on pushing the family cart, grinning as he added apples. 2 teenage girls debated whether to buy the generic cereal or the brand name box, finally laughing when they realized the generic was now affordable. An elderly veteran in a worn army jacket patted the cashier's hand and said, "Haven't seen prices like this since the 70s. Bless you." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to shout the truth that it was him, not chance, who had made this happen. Yet something told him the anonymity was important. If people thanked the company, not a man, the dignity remained intact. So he slipped quietly toward the back of the store, where the break room door stood ajar. Inside, employees gathered around a pot of coffee, voices low but full of excitement. "You see that mom with 3 kids? Walked out smiling for the first time in months." "Yeah." Denise almost cried right along with her. "Feels good, doesn't it? Like we're doing more than just punching numbers on a register." Richard leaned against the doorway, unseen, and felt a surge of pride he had not known in years. These workers, his workers, were proud not of profits, but of purpose. For once, the soul of Heartwarming aligned with its people. As he turned to leave, he nearly bumped into a teenage stock clerk carrying a box of canned goods. The boy froze. "Sir, sorry, didn't mean." Richard smiled. "You're doing a good job, keep it up." The boy blinked. "Thanks. Not many bosses say that." Richard walked away with the boy's words echoing in his chest. Not many bosses say that. Maybe that was the real indictment of his empire. Not prices, not policies, but the absence of simple humanity. That evening, he drove back north along Lakeshore Drive. The skyline shimmered, the frozen lake glittering beside it. Yet he no longer measured the city by its towers or traffic. He measured it by the laughter of children in his store, by the relief on a grandmother's face, by the small acts of kindness rippling outward. Back in his penthouse, Richard sat at his massive desk. He opened a leather-bound notebook that had long been empty and began to write. Not numbers, not projections. Words, plans, dreams. A program not just for Southside, but for every Heartwarming in the nation. No child hungry would be the cornerstone, but he imagined more. Medical discounts, community kitchens, partnerships with schools. The pen scratched across the page long into the night. For the first time, Richard felt he was building something not of glass and steel, but of flesh and spirit. Something his daughter, though she did not yet know the truth, might one day be proud of. As midnight bells tolled faintly from a nearby church, Richard closed the notebook. He pressed his hand against the cover and whispered, "This is how I make it right." Winter loosened its grip slowly, but Chicago remained wrapped in gray skies and damp winds. For Richard Hale, however, the season of silence inside his life was cracking open. The pilot program at the Southside store had been running for several weeks now, and word of it had begun to spread far beyond the neighborhood. Families traveled across town just to buy milk and diapers without fear. Local papers picked up the story, and whispers of change followed Richard wherever he went. Still, he told no one the truth. To the public, it was a corporate experiment. To him, it was redemption in motion. Each night, he drove home through the crowded streets, carrying the weight of both shame and hope. The shame of wasted years, and the hope that perhaps, at last, he was learning to be more than a merchant of numbers. One evening, compelled by a force he could hardly name, Richard returned to Hyde Park Cafe. The small diner buzzed with the same easy noise. Clinking mugs, sizzling bacon, the low hum of conversation. He slid into the same corner booth where he had once spoken with Emily. His eyes drifted to the door, half expecting her to walk in again. And she did. Emily entered with her 2 children this time. The baby, bundled in a puffy coat, cooed against her shoulder. The older boy clutched her hand, eyes wide at the sight of the dessert case near the counter. Richard's breath caught. He had imagined this moment for weeks, but the reality struck him deeper. Here was the daughter of Laura, the daughter he had never known, standing not 10 feet away, living proof of both his greatest loss and his second chance. Emily ordered modestly, 2 small hot chocolates, 1 slice of pie to share, and a coffee for herself. She counted her change carefully before sliding it across the counter, then guided the children to a booth near Richard's quote. He hesitated, heart pounding. Approaching her felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, but silence felt worse. He rose slowly, coffee in hand, and crossed the narrow aisle. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Emily looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Of course," she said, shifting to make room. Richard slid into the booth across from her. The children studied him curiously. The older boy finally asked, "Are you my mom's friend?" Richard's throat tightened. "I'd like to be," he said softly. The boy grinned, satisfied with the answer, and reached eagerly for his hot chocolate. For the next half hour, Richard listened more than he spoke. Emily told small stories about juggling 2 jobs, about the endless math of bills and groceries, about how she sometimes skipped meals so her kids would never go hungry. She spoke without self-pity, only with the steady resolve of a mother who had no choice but to endure. Each word struck Richard like a hammer. He had once abandoned Laura because he told himself ambition was more important than family. Now, decades later, he sat across from Laura's daughter, realizing the same hunger still haunted her life. He felt both devastated and determined. When the pie arrived, Emily cut it carefully into 3 pieces. She slid the smallest slice onto her own plate and gave the larger ones to her children. Richard watched, overwhelmed by the quiet sacrifice. Without thinking, he slid his plate toward her. "Take mine," he said. Emily blinked. "No, really? You don't have to." "I insist," Richard said gently. "I already had dinner." She studied him, uncertain, then accepted. Her smile was small but genuine, and in that moment, Richard realized something he had not felt in years: belonging. The cafe grew quieter as the evening stretched on. The jukebox in the corner clicked and began to play an old Sinatra tune, its warm melody drifting through the air. Richard sat with Emily and her children, feeling as though he had stepped out of time. For decades, his life had been measured in contracts and quarterly earnings. Tonight, it was measured in pie crumbs and laughter spilling from a little boy's mouth. Emily dabbed at her baby's chin with a napkin, then leaned back with a tired sigh. "Some days I don't know how we make it," she admitted, her voice low. "But then they smile, and it's worth it, every bit of it." Richard's heart clenched. He wanted desperately to tell her the truth, that she was not alone, that her mother had once loved him, that he was the father she had never known. But the words remained trapped behind fear. Would she believe him? Would she hate him for the years he had vanished? For the nights Laura must have wept alone? Instead, he said, "You're stronger than you realize." Emily looked at him curiously. "You talk like someone who knows what it means to lose something." "Oh?" Richard's gaze drifted to the window, where snowflakes swirled under the streetlights. "I do," he whispered, "more than I care to admit." The baby fussed, and Emily rocked him gently, humming a lullaby Richard recognized. His chest tightened. Laura used to sing the same tune. For a moment, memory and present overlapped, and he nearly broke. The waitress stopped by with the check. Emily reached for it, but Richard slid a 20 under the edge of the plate. "This one's on me." And Emily shook her head. "I can't let you." "You can," Richard interrupted softly. "And you should. Consider it a neighborly kindness." She hesitated, then gave a grateful nod. "Thank you." The children bundled into their coats, preparing to leave. At the door, the little boy turned and waved at Richard. "Bye, mister. Thanks for the pie." Richard smiled, raising a hand. "Bye, kiddo. Take care of your mama." When the door closed behind them, Richard remained seated, staring at the empty booth. The warmth of their presence lingered like a glow against the winter night. He realized then that his redemption would not come through policies or boardrooms alone. It would come through moments like these, small, human, fragile. As he stepped out into the cold, the city lights shimmered against the snow. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness waiting for him. He felt the pull of family, the family he had lost, the family he might still reclaim if he had the courage. Richard pulled his coat tighter, whispering into the night, "Laura, give me strength. It's time to make this right." Spring arrived shyly in Chicago, with patches of green breaking through the gray. The river glistened beneath a pale sun, and tulips began to poke from planters along Michigan Avenue. For Richard Hale, the season carried more than the promise of warmer weather. It carried the weight of choices he could no longer postpone. The No Child Hungry program had spread to 3 more Hale Mart stores. Media outlets were calling it an unprecedented move in corporate responsibility, though critics accused Richard of staging a publicity stunt. He ignored the noise. What mattered were the letters piling on his desk, handwritten notes from mothers, fathers, grandparents who thanked Hale Mart for restoring their dignity. One grandmother wrote, "For the first time in years, I can buy formula for my granddaughter without shame. God bless you." Yet amid the praise, Richard's heart remained restless. Emily still did not know the truth. He saw her once more at the cafe, and though they exchanged friendly words, he could not bring himself to confess. Each time he looked into her hazel eyes, the same shade as Laura's, he felt the weight of decades pressing him down. One evening, unable to sleep, Richard pulled an old box from the back of his closet. Inside lay a bundle of photographs, yellowed with age. Laura's face smiled up at him from every angle. Picnics in the park, long walks by the lake, nights spent dreaming of futures that never came. He pressed a trembling hand to one photo where Laura held a baby he had never met. His daughter, Emily. Tears blurred his vision. For the first time in years, he prayed aloud. "Laura, forgive me. Give me the courage to do what I should have done long ago." The next morning, Richard drove back to the South Side store. He wore no disguise this time. He wanted to stand among the people openly, to see the impact with his own eyes. As he walked through the aisles, customers greeted him with smiles, unaware he was the architect of their relief. Children tugged at their mother's sleeves, holding cartons of milk with joy instead of fear. Near the entrance, a community bulletin board had been covered with thank you notes, crayon drawings of milk bottles, stick figure families, words spelled awkwardly but sincerely, "Thank you for helping my mom." Richard stood before it, overwhelmed. For the first time in decades, he felt proud not of his empire, but of his humanity. Yet, even as pride filled him, a question echoed louder. "When will you tell her?" That evening, Richard returned once more to Hyde Park Cafe. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the familiar scent of coffee and pie wrapped around him. Emily was there, seated in the corner booth with her children, their laughter rising above the hum of the diner. Richard paused, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had avoided, the truth he had buried. He could no longer remain silent. He approached the booth slowly, his hands trembling. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Emily looked up with a warm smile. "Of course." "Oh." Richard slid into the seat across from her. For a moment, he simply watched her, the curve of her face so much like Laura's that it ached. Finally, he drew a breath. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said the first time we met." Her smile faded. "What is it?" Richard's throat tightened. "I knew your mother, Laura. Years ago, we were very close. I walked away when I shouldn't have, chasing ambition instead of love. And I've lived with that mistake every day since." His voice shook. "Emily, I believe I'm your father." The cafe seemed to fall silent around them. Emily stared at him, eyes wide, searching his face for a trace of deceit. "My father," she whispered. "No, I never knew him. My mom never spoke about him." "I know," Richard said, tears brimming, "and that's my fault. I failed her. I failed you. But when I saw you at the store, when I saw that photograph of her in your wallet, I knew you have her eyes, her strength. Emily, I can't erase the years, but I want to be here now, if you'll let me." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee. For a long moment, she said nothing. The baby fussed, and she held him close, rocking gently. Richard's heart pounded in the silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice fragile. "All my life, I wondered why my mom carried so much alone. I thought maybe she'd been abandoned. And now, here you are." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I can see you mean it." Richard nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I'll wait as long as it takes. I'll prove it not with words, but with actions. Whatever you need, whatever your children need, I'll be here." Emily studied him, then gave a small nod. "Then start by being their grandfather. They deserve more than empty promises." Richard's chest broke open with relief. He reached across the table, and Emily let him take her hand. For the first time in decades, he felt the warmth of family pulse through his skin. That night, as he drove home along Lakeshore Drive, the city lights glittered against the dark lake. He no longer saw them as symbols of ambition. They were beacons, guiding him back to what mattered. When he stepped into his penthouse, he didn't feel the old emptiness. He carried with him the sound of a child's laughter, the touch of his daughter's hand, the memory of Laura's eyes living on in Emily. He whispered into the quiet, "I made mistakes, but I found my way home." For Richard Hale, redemption had come not in the boardroom, but at a diner table shared with family. And in that simple truth lay the greatest wealth he would ever know. The quiet at the end of Richard's journey did not come from boardrooms or balance sheets, but from the sound of a family finding one another across years of silence. The lights of Chicago still glimmered on the river, but for him, they no longer measured ambition, they marked the path back home. His story leaves us with a simple question, dear friends. If you found hope in these chapters, leave a comment with the number 1. If you felt something was missing or wished to share your thoughts, type 0. Your voice matters, just as every small act of kindness matters. What we witnessed through 8 chapters was not the rise of a company, but the rise of a heart learning to love again. The lesson is as old as time. Love and forgiveness are the true treasures, worth more than towers of money or fleets of cars. Redemption is never out of reach. A man who once thought only of profit found his way back through a single child's cry, and in that cry he discovered his soul. It reminds us that unconditional kindness can shift destinies. Everyone deserves to be loved and to belong to a family. Humanity is always more precious than status or wealth. And when someone is given even a single chance, they can shine brighter than any success story on paper. Think of the small truths in your own life. Maybe it's the Sunday dinner where the family gathers around a table crowded with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and pie. Maybe it's the memory of a grandchild's first steps across the living room, or the phone call you didn't expect from an old friend. Happiness doesn't live in ledgers. It blooms in these fragile, fleeting moments we share, like a porch light left burning for someone coming home late. One simple act of love can guide us through the darkest roads of life. When we are young, we chase the world. When we are older, we remember what really matters. The people sitting beside us, the ones who forgive, the ones who hold our hand. The story of Richard, Emily, and the children is not about wealth. It is about rediscovering family. It is about a man who finally chose to live, not for himself, but for those he once failed. And in that choice, he gave us a mirror. Each of us carries the chance to repair what was broken, to reach across time with love. So tonight, as you sit by your lamp or listen from your porch, take a moment to reflect. Is there someone in your life waiting for a word, a call, a gesture of forgiveness? Is there a place where you might bring light, where once there was only silence? If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it, not as an obligation, but as a way to keep the circle of kindness alive. And if it lingers with you, subscribe so you'll be here for the next tale. Because stories like this remind us of something timeless. Redemption is not about erasing the past, but about building a future where love has the final word. And sometimes, dear friends, that word is as simple and powerful as home.